Good evening, everyone. My name is Jacinta Thompson, and I'm the Executive Director and Events and Exhibitions Producer for the Bob Hawke Ministerial Centre. It is my pleasure to welcome you all here to the Hawke Centre and the University of South Australia. In doing so, I take this opportunity to acknowledge that the University of South Australia is on the traditional country of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains. We recognise and respect their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship with the land, and we acknowledge that they are of continuing importance to the Kaurna people living today. We are thrilled to welcome back Dr. Norman Swan as he discusses his latest book, So You Want to Know What's Good for Your Kids. A very warm welcome. Lovely to have you back here, Norman. It's been, I think, fourth visit? Three. Okay. And we're talking about 2026 already. No pressure. So warm welcome to Dr. Norman Swan and, of course, Professor Susan Hillier. The session tonight is being recorded and will be available on the Hawke Centre website next week. I encourage you to bring this to the attention of your friends and colleagues who could not join us tonight. We are also live streaming this presentation, and I welcome our online audience. Hello everyone. There's over 400 people watching tonight, which is great. As we are filming, can I please ask that you switch your phones to silent to avoid interruptions? Trained in paediatrics, Dr. Norman Swan was one of the first medically qualified journalists in Australia, with a broadcast career spanning more than 30 years. In addition to being an active journalist and health broadcaster, Dr. Swan has a deep strategic knowledge of the Australian healthcare system and is committed to evidence-based approaches to help young people, especially in his role as a board member of the Australian Research Alliance for Children and Youth. I'll just wait for people to settle. Hello everyone, welcome. Following his presentation, he will be joined by Professor Susan Hillier. Professor Susan Hillier is an academic with UniSA and clinician with teaching and research interests in the broad field of neuroscience and rehabilitation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Norman Swan. Thank you.
Thanks, Jacinta, and it's great to be back, and it's always great to be back here at the Hawke Centre where the audiences are simply amazing, and welcome to everybody who's online. And I too would like to acknowledge country, land that has never been ceded and never will be. It's never been harder than today to be a parent. And by the way, Actually, I'm not going to do it with this room, but because I never know whether parents are here with their own children, their adult children. But a couple of times what I've done is put up your hand if either you, when you were a parent, or you as a parent, aimed to parent differently from the parenting you had experienced. So it creates arguments afterwards, Really? Okay. It's an almost universal phenomenon. So what is it about the parenting that you had that was so crap that you want to actually do it better? But it's actually never been harder to be a parent than today. And there are people here who probably feel they did it hard too. But in the old days, when I grew up in Glasgow, there were 2 television channels, a couple of newspapers, magazines, and the people who really annoyed you with your advice was your parents and their friends and your neighbours, and that was it. And it was incredibly annoying. Now it comes out of your ears. There are multiple channels, there are social media channels, there are influencers. There are people who are consuming this in a wide range and telling you what they've heard. And what do you believe? You're in the sea of knowledge and you don't know what to believe. And if you overlay that on another phenomenon, which is that really over the last 40 or 50 years, there's a new phenomenon never before seen in human history. Adults are having children. For most of human history, children have had children. They've had children when they were 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 20. And now, I think the median age is getting towards 30, but there are plenty of people having their first children well into their 30s and sometimes their early 40s. It's a good thing? Bad thing? Well, it just is. But it does create a very different phenomenon. The outcomes of teenage pregnancy are not that good. But when it was the norm and society was getting around it, maybe it wasn't that bad. But the point I'm saying here is parents are different today than before, and they are older, and they've got more life experience. And so you've got a complicated environment with lots of advice coming out of your ears, not knowing what to trust, and you're probably a bit more anxious about parenting getting to that age because, you haven't got many years left. So how many are you going to have? You're going to have one, you're going to have two, or you're going to have none. And then accidentally you have one. So life is complicated. Do you want to bring a child into this environment when there's climate change and everything else going on? It's a complicated world. And what I believe is nobody needs advice anymore. What they need is to be treated as adults and given the facts. And you're adults and you make up your own mind. There is a problem here in the literature. So I've deliberately kept this book from birth to the age of 10. My publisher was quite keen on me going through to adolescence. I said, no, we'll just do till 10. That was self-preservation, but I had a rationale for it. There's plenty of information, plenty of research on early childhood. In fact, some very good research in early childhood here in this city. There's very good research and a lot of knowledge about adolescence. But there is a real gap in the scientific literature about what are called the middle years. We don't know as much about the years from 5 to 10 as we should. And that's because researchers have believed, funders have believed, policymakers have believed, doctors have believed, and parents have come to believe that those are the salad years. Yeah, we've got some hard work to do when the baby's a toddler, but just kick back, relax when they're in primary school, enjoy those salad years until the dark clouds of adolescence descend over your household. Those are no longer the salad years, if indeed they ever were, and they probably never were. So the age at puberty, so puberty tends to hit earlier and earlier. So the hormonal changes of puberty can hit 8, 9 years old. Any parent here of a 9-year-old daughter who's behaving as though she's 20 will know that only too well. So puberty, we don't know why, but puberty is moving earlier and earlier. But those so-called salad years, any parent of a child here between 5 and 10 will tell you they are not the salad years. They are, and any primary school teacher will tell you those are not the salad years. Those are the runways. Those years are the runway to the rest of that child's life. It's true in the early years, but it's also true in those salad years. And there's a dearth of research. You've got to go hunting for it, but it is there. And it is there particularly in Australian research. Globally, Australian research is actually very strong in this area relative to other countries who've focused on the early years and adolescence. So I wanted to fill in that gap because it's a very important social, political, parenting gap to be talking about in terms there. So and then there are other reasons for focusing on this, and possibly in the conversation with Susan will expand on this. Is that there are twice, in a child's life in those first 10 years where there's a lot of brain plasticity. Now, there's brain plasticity throughout life. We can change things. Susan's into rehabilitation science, and you would not be in rehabilitation science if you did not believe that the brain is plastic and able to be manipulated. But it gets harder and harder the older that you are. But there are two periods of a lot of brain plasticity in a child's life. One is the first 2 years, so those early childhood years, incredibly important. And the influence on the child's brain at that point, the shaping of the brain, is largely the carers that child comes in contact with. Parents, grandparents, childcare centre, and so on. But it's also the village. The village is really important, even in those early years. A pioneer in the study of child development was Professor Clyde Hertzman at the University of British Columbia. And he developed an index of early childhood development called the EDI, Early Development Index. It's been validated for Australia, slightly manipulated, but more or less validated for Australia. So he worked in Vancouver, and he did very large studies of EDI to validate these measures. I can't remember how many measures are in the EDI, it was a few. Then what he did was, he mapped his EDI findings, scores, onto the map of Vancouver on zip codes. And nobody here is going to fall off their chair if I tell you that the EDIs in poor areas of Vancouver, where they didn't have social resources, where they had high levels of fine particulate air pollution, high levels of smoking, low levels of education, the EDIs were lower. And you could have a child whose parental and family situation was the same in a wealthy suburb. So in other words, they had all the advantages of educated parents. If there were genes involved, the genes, etc., we'll go there in a minute. But if they happened to live in a postcode with low EDIs, their EDI was lower than the child in the rich suburb. So the village has an effect. Now, what happens in those early years is that the baby and the toddler's brain absorbs everything that's going and grows like topsy. And in fact, the child's brain, when they hit school, is overgrown. And you can tell this, 7-year-olds can't plan. 7-year-olds have got no executive control. They're impulsive. That's why we overdiagnose ADHD in some kids. They just can't plan. And particularly a boy, you say to a 7-year-old boy, empty the dishwasher and open the door, pull out the rack. You actually got to walk them through the the role of the frontal lobes. But it's overgrown because they've absorbed so much, they've learned so much. And that can be shaped in the environment, and it could be, I talk in the book about weathering and how an adverse physical environment, how racism to some extent, this is American research, can actually shape that 2-year-old's brain in not a great way. But there's a second opportunity for plasticity, which is getting towards the age of 10 and through to early adolescence. Because the child has got to be prepared for the rest of their life. And you can't go into the rest of your life with this overgrown brain that absorbs everything and really just doesn't have great executive function. So what happens is the brain gets pruned. Neural pathways are modified. And that is the second period. It's just like gardener or you in the garden pruning the bushes. You prune the bushes. Now, unlike pruning the bushes before summer comes in, and if you stuff it up, you've got a second chance next summer, this is the one chance you've got. And if the pruning goes wrong, you can actually change that child's life forever. Very hard to change. That is why you do not want a child. I talk about this bullshit thing that people think that they can introduce alcohol. If you introduce alcohol to a young child and they can see sensible drinking, this trains them in sensible drinking. It actually trains them to become a drinker as they're older. This is research on 10,000 children done partly through the University of Sydney. So you do not expose a young child's brain, and a young child I mean through to 15, 16, 17, if you can at all avoid it, to drugs and alcohol and other drugs, because it affects the pruning and affects the brain and can affect it forever. That's why you do not want a child who is overweight coming into adolescence, because the pruning can actually change the hormonal control of appetite. And that is why you've got to be bloody careful of screens in those years, because screens are designed to be as addictive as nicotine, heroin, nicotine and heroin and alcohol. They are nobody's maliciously designed them to change a child's brain, but almost certainly they will change a child's brain the way drugs do. And we've got to be very careful about screens. So then you look at what's going on in these 10 years. And so when I started writing this book, I was skeptical of people saying, well, there's an epidemic of eating disorders in the under 10s. There's an epidemic of anxiety disorders in the under 10s. I thought, this is bull. This is people trying to manufacture work for themselves. But in fact, there is a very disturbing rise in eating disorders in the under 10s. Not just in girls, but in boys as well. Predominantly in girls, but mostly. And it's not anorexia nervosa or bulimia nervosa. I mean, they do exist. It's mixed patterns of eating disorders. And there's another eating disorder emerging in 5-year-olds, which is a restrictive feeding disorder, which is thought to be about anxious parenting at the time of introducing solids, and I can come back to that later. So these eating disorders are genuinely rising. And anxiety disorders, I thought, well, this is just, so I wasn't thinking this was parents inventing stuff. This is parents actually, and teachers, recognizing the truly anxious child. When we all went to school, there was always a kid at the back of the class who was the teacher's pet, and got all the jotters out and so on, and did everything. That's often the child who was petrified the whole time, was scared of being discovered, didn't want to be actually asked to do anything, perform in front of the class. And they were sitting there quivering in anxiety. So I thought, well, this is just parents recognizing anxiety in their children and wanting help for it, and there's not enough child psychologists or child psychiatrists around, and therefore that demand on services becomes clear. But there is a rise in anxiety disorders. Right through this period of when the brain is changing and incredibly adaptable and changeable. What is it that's causing these? Well, I'll come to parenting and parenting style. Now, one of my aims in this book is not to blame parents for everything, because you've got the village, and the village is changing stuff. And screens are the new kid on the block. The rise in these disorders, it's almost uncanny how closely it mirrors the rise in these disorders. That does not prove cause and effect. The rise in HIV/AIDS in the early 80s mirrored very closely the rise in VHS, video recorder ownership. So you could possibly imagine a link there, but seriously, you're not going to say the video recorder ownership created the pandemic of HIV. Of course it didn't. And you're not necessarily saying that screens do. But there is a mechanism. And the mechanism psychologically is something called upward comparison. Now, there's always been upward comparison. So upward comparison is there's always somebody more beautiful than you, more handsome than you, thinner, more muscular, has more money than you, has greater charisma than you. And you feel and associate that with a social network, which might be on WhatsApp, or even if you're not accessing social media, the opportunity for cyberbullying, because you're not aspiring to that. It creates anxiety and almost certainly creates the eating disorder. It is almost certainly behind a lot of the eating disorders that we're seeing. And the people who design these programs design them to be addictive. You can have a kid with ADHD who a teacher is struggling to get to complete tasks, and they will sit on a video game all Saturday. They won't complete a task, but they'll sit. That's because they're addictive, and they're actually sucking people in. So it's not just the fact these screens exist, you're getting a dosage effect, which is acute and continuous. And it's made worse by the education system, who insists on using screens for education. And the problem with screens for education is, so parents think, well, I'm giving my child a screen because they're going to learn about the world. Well, there's evidence that they don't learn about the world from screens. Even with parents who are doing the right thing and curating the content, etc. They've done experiments, for example, where they give young kids a building block exercise on an iPad, and they learn how to build blocks on the iPad. They take away the iPad and put the same blocks in front of the child. They haven't a clue what to do. They don't necessarily translate what they learn on a screen to the real world. And there's growing concern that comprehension changes when you've got something on a screen rather than physically in front of you. It's complex because, well, maybe Susan and I will get into that conversation about reading. I do talk about literacy in the book. And I'm running out of time before we start a conversation with Susan, but I just want to describe parenting styles. And a lot of this comes from, well, people have kind of known it for a long time. Maybe you and I can talk about genes versus the environment when we're having this conversation. But a lot of this comes from the Australian Temperament Project and the longitudinal study of Australian children. Australian Temperament Project started about 40 years ago, picked up parents, learned a lot about these parents, and they had babies that were around about 4 months old and recruited them. And now these babies have had babies. So we're now into the third generation. There's incredibly detailed knowledge about parenting, parenting style, the child's temperament that they were born with and how that evolved, and then how this translates to the next generation. And they are pretty confident that what's been said about parenting style plays out. So if you take, say, 3 dimensions of parenting, one is cold to warm. So cold is, I have trouble expressing emotions. I love my, in one analysis of it, I do love my children, but I really find it hard to actually express that to them. You come across as cold, not emotionally expressive to your child. You're not giving back emotionally to the child. Not a great style to have for parenting. I'll come back to that in a minute. And then on the other end, there's warmth. You're all over the child, you're kissing them and hugging them, and they know that you love them, and you tell them all the time, and you show them that you do. If all you look at is cold to warm, you're missing something really important. And that next layer is about stuff that's old-fashioned. Setting expectations. There's been this revolt against setting expectations. Oh, you can't set expectations. That's what my parents did to me. Turned me into a neurotic wreck. It actually didn't turn you into a neurotic wreck. The evidence is that if expectations are set, your level of anxiety goes down as a child, and you feel more secure. Now, this is not you're going to become, this is expectations set on me. You're going to become a Jewish doctor. It's reasonable expectations. As a parent, imagine you're a parent in a First Nations community. Who do you want teaching your child? A teacher who doesn't set expectations and thinks every child's going to be hopeless, or a child who comes in and expects every child in that class to perform to the maximum of their potential? That's the parent. You're a First Nations parent. That's the teacher you want for your kids. That's the teacher we all want for our kids. So setting expectations, the child knows where they stand. Boundaries. You have limits. The child knows what your limits are, and you're consistent. What children want and what the evidence suggests works, and with good outcomes, is predictability, consistency, routines. God, routines drive couples nuts, because you'll have one partner setting routines, and then the other partner comes home at 7:00 at night, knackered from work, and says, why can't I play with the kids? Well, they've got to go to bed because we have a routine. Why? And you have an argument about it. But routines work. Now, overlay that on warm to cold. If you're cold and harsh and disciplinarian, that is associated with poor outcomes for your child, according to the evidence. Let's go to the warm end of the scale, because you think, well, what could be bad at the warm end of the scale? Well, here's what can be bad at the warm end of the scale. Is you say, I don't want to impose my judgment on the child. I want them to learn and make their own mistakes in the world, and they can find out for themselves. That is indulgent, permissive parenting, and is associated also with poor outcomes. The child, and I'm sweeping generalization here because there'll be lots of exceptions to this, the child of the extreme end of warmth with no limits, no boundaries, no predictability, no routines. In other words, it can be chaotic parenting, and you can often recognize chaotic parenting because the house is chaotic. And interestingly, they found if you just tidy up the house, the parenting improves. That child becomes I've said this is a sweeping generalization, but according to the longitudinal data, that child becomes entitled as an adult, tends not to complete things like university courses, and when they do get a job, after about a week, they know better than anybody else about the job, and everybody else is an idiot. And then 3 weeks later, they've got the sack and got to move on. So warm parenting at the extreme is associated with poor results. It's where you find that balance between setting boundaries, limits within warmth and unconditional love. That's the sweet spot. But here's the other thing. Parenting is a game of tennis. I talk about this a lot in the book. We serve, well, in the beginning, we serve and the kids return. And you can do it from day 2 or day 1 or 2. I was taught by an American pediatrician called Barry Brazelton. Some of you might, be professional, know the name. So he taught you, one of the things you learn when you're training in pediatrics is the examination of the newborn. Fontanelles, the eyes, muscle tone, the heart, tummy, hips, etc. And he said, before you do all that and really annoy the baby, play with the baby. So you'd lift the baby and play with the baby. It was great fun. And the parents would actually watch you, particularly first parents, and with amazement, because you can have a conversation with a newborn baby. And you behave like an idiot, essentially, and you're talking to this baby. And then you then get tuned to that baby, because the baby will give you back stuff. And again, parents here will know that if they've got 2 or 3 kids, they'll know one kid was really cuddly. I could do anything with them. And the other kid just didn't like to be handled and was irritable and cried. That's not pathology. That's just different ways. And then you tone it down with a kid who cries and irritable, and then you amp it up with a kid who's like California and laid back and you can do anything with them. The kid who is irritable and doesn't like being handled that much, this tracks through life from day 2, day 1, birth. And that child tends to be the shy child when they're 3 or 4, doesn't like mixing with kids, doesn't like going out that much. And there's always a kid who more likes to keep to themselves than other kids. This is not pathology. This is not a child who's going to have an anxiety disorder. This is just, there's 400 or 500 people in this room, another 400 people there. There are plenty of people in this room who are just like that. And there are plenty of people in the room who are gregarious. And it's just the way we are. It doesn't predict anything. So on top of this, you overlay this serve and return. Of course, as the children get older, they serve to you, and then you've got to return. But some kids, when they return serve, will return with a top spin, and you're running to the corner of the court, and they'll come back with another spin, and you're running all over the court, and you're completely knackered, and another kid will just play a straight back to you. And it's always going to be that way. And the key here is that if you don't, and this is one of the reasons why you don't give advice in a parenting book, is that it's one-on-one. You have this dyadic relationship with each child, which is different and evolves as the child gets older. So whilst I spent 5-10 minutes talking to you about parenting style, in fact, your parenting style changes. Some kids need a bit more discipline than others. Other kids learn self-control much faster. And the third level here, and I've got to stop talking because we're going to have a chat, is really how controlling you are as a parent. So in other words, if you're a parent, we all want our children to be safe. We all, but if you feel the world is a dangerous place and you don't want your child, and it kind of starts when you're feeding the child, is, they haven't eaten enough. I've got to force them to eat. Rather than picking up the signal, the baby's full or the toddler's full, they don't want any more. You stop feeding them. If you go override that, that's the child who's going to be fat. And you've done it for the best of intentions because you think the child hasn't eaten enough. The parent who does not want their child to be exposed to stress or fear or anxiety, and therefore cuts that off whenever the child experiences that. Is it any wonder that child becomes anxious as they get older because they haven't learned to cope with fear and anxiety and stress when they were younger? Whereas the more functional parenting is about, why are you crying? Not talking at them, hearing them. Could it have been done differently? The general principles, which most of us here would do, is that we run scared of stuff. And anyway, I'll stop there and we'll have a conversation about it. I wish in 20 minutes I could give you the whole story, but unfortunately I can't. Thank you.
Right, I think you've whetted their appetite, so I'll let you have a little drink and I'll tell you a little story, which you haven't heard. This is the first time that I met Norman, and I think I met a 7-year-old Norman, but a very intelligent 7-year-old Norman. So we were in a conference room, I can't remember if it was Melbourne or Sydney. It was the beginning of a big conversation amongst a whole lot of people in Australia around creating a big stroke coalition, so I work in stroke. And you were the facilitator. And there was a controversy at this time, this is like 100 years ago, where there was this controversial new treatment for hyperacute stroke management, thrombolysis, clot busting. And it was controversial, even though there was really good evidence that it would work, but there was a group of specialists who refused to do it and a group who really wanted to do it. And your tactic was to keep asking why. Which, if you ask me, what's kind of the quintessential 5-year-old, is they just keep asking why. So is that why you wrote the book, Why?
Yeah.
Because you've just got this perennial why in your brain, your inner 5-year-old?
Well, I think it's important to maintain curiosity. So I spend most of my life on Radio National, and our picture of the average Radio National audience is not somebody who's got a PhD or who lives in a fancy suburb. It's somebody who maintains their curiosity about the world and life about them, and I think that's really important.
And what do you think's happening to the why with 5 to 10-year-olds now? Do you think that's... To me, what the why question is sort of the manifestation of a...
Well, the why question is the most important one,
yeah.
to find, so that you know what to do. So, for example, I was kind of alluding to it in the beginning of the talk, but I got distracted onto other stuff. But I think one of the things that happens when you're an adult having a child is that you want to be the perfect parent. Mm-hmm. And I strongly advise, well, having said that, I don't advise against anything, I strongly caution people not to want to be the perfect parent. Because what is the perfect parent? Is the perfect parent the one who protects their child against everything that I just talked about? Or is the perfect parent somewhere in the middle? Is it possible to be the perfect parent 24/7? Is it possible to be the perfect parent at 6 o'clock in the evening when you're hungry and tired after work and the child's hungry and tired and ratty and your partner's not home yet? No. And so what I talk about in the book is it's actually okay to be good enough. Mm-hmm. Now, the good enough parent was initially written about in the Freudian sense by Donald Winnicott, who was a pediatrician in London, pediatrician/psychiatrist in London in the early 50s, the late 40s, early 50s. And so he wrote about it there, and it was actually quite misogynist. It was really against mothers. And then an Austrian-American writer who's kind of a psychologist, it wasn't great stuff, Bruno Bettelheim, also wrote about the good enough parent. But the reality is, forget all that, it's actually pretty good to be good enough. Mm-hmm. And that's what your aim should be.
Mm-hmm. I have another question, which is, I used to say to my kids, when they felt that I wasn't being a good parent, is that that's fine, I'm putting money aside for your therapy. So I do have a sort of a question sitting out there is, how much money do they need? But you can answer that later. But I do have some great questions from the audience, and I have worked out that Norman has 6 grandchildren, so congratulations on that. That's a great delight. And we obviously have some grandparents in the audience, so we have a few questions around grandparenting. And well, the first one is, how can we support grandparents who are increasingly involved in taking care of children in this age group?
Step 1, buy the book.
Yeah. Tick, yeah.
Well, actually, I find something interesting. This is, there are a lot of grandparents, I can see it in the room, if you're nodding, as I'm talking. We thought that all along. Why doesn't my idiot child know this? But they're actually quietly buying the book to give to their. So just have a read. So the problem with grandparenting is that we can overthink it. Mm-hmm. And if you're the grandparent who's making up for the fact that your kids can't afford childcare and you're there all day, I mean, I have one child. When I go and look after, so most of my grandkids are overseas, but I have 2 grandchildren in Sydney who are quite young, twins, and my daughter tells me what I need to do at 9:15, 9:17, 11:14, but she goes out the door to work. I just do what I want. They never know the difference. And these are very happy kids, by the way, because they've got routine.
Yeah.
And the things that you would differ with them. My youngest daughter, we had a family event recently, and my youngest daughter had to give a speech about me, and she was in no uncertain, she was very funny, but she got my parenting style down to a T. So I just think that we have to live with it. The really serious side of this is when you've got a grandchild who's going off the rails, mm-hmm. and you can see behavior that's really problematic. And it's not easy to introduce that into the conversation. But if you start blaming the parental style of your children, you're going to get nowhere.
Mm-hmm. Which is sort of the next question about grandparents is this some advice, which maybe you don't want to give, but maybe you could suggest. Do you keep to the parents' rules versus do your own thing as grandparents? Clearly you don't, because you shut the door and do that. But is there such a thing as intergenerational consistency?
Yes. So I talk a fair bit in the book about choosing a carer or a care environment for your child. And the important thing about choosing a caring environment for the child is that the caring environment you've got for your child, mm-hmm. which is what my middle daughter's on about. She wants me to be caring for the child in that way. But what you want is actually to know who is caring for your child. There's a childcare centre. Is that every day of the week? Mm. Do you have career development in this childcare centre? Mm-hmm. What times are the meal times for the carers? Mm-hmm. Studies have shown that carers are hungry. They don't get properly fed at work. In some disadvantaged childcare centres, the carers are giving their food to the kids. Mm-hmm. So you actually want to know about the caring and watch the care. Now, if they don't want you to watch the care, you've probably got a problem there. Mm. And is it warm with boundaries, limits, and so on? It might not be exactly what you would do. And if it is, that's pretty good. And it's likely that if you want that as a child, your parents, i.e. the grandparents, are likely to be doing that as well. But it's hard job to be parents in the current world, even harder to be grandparents.
I think you've answered another question here, which someone's put in, some people feel it's lazy or neglectful to put children into childcare, particularly early on. And is it important, actually, for child's early development? Or is it better for the parent to care as long as possible?
You know, there's not much evidence of that.
Ah.
It's the quality of care that a child gets.
Yeah.
I did an event like this in Hobart a couple of weeks ago, and a mother asked the question saying, I work for the Antarctic Division, and I'm away for months of the year. And it racks me with guilt. Yes, I've got a partner, and he's there looking after the child, but it racks me with guilt, and the child's in childcare. If the child is getting consistency, routine, warmth, and boundary setting, and limits set on them when they're a bit older, and they're being well fed, the child's going to do just fine. The child will always know who their parent is. And interestingly, as a grandparent of grandchildren that I only see at the most twice a year, they know who their grandparents are as well. And that's not through Zoom. We hardly ever Zoom. They just know.
Yeah, yeah. You touched on this idea of guilt, and there's quite a few people out there feeling guilty. Obviously, I do too, because I've put money aside for therapy. But
well, it's the old Jewish joke. Why does your mother come with 2 suitcases? One's got the guilt in it.
See, every religion's got guilt. There's Catholic guilt, there's Protestant guilt, there's Jewish guilt. We're just all guilty. Yep. Anyway, so there is a question here. Am I ruining my children by working too much? And again, I think you've kind of alluded to how you feel about that.
As long as you are confident in the care and the primary caregivers that child has got. And there's also, the textbook doesn't change if you're gay, bisexual, queer. The parenting rules are the same. It doesn't matter what your sexual orientation is or your gender identity is. Parenting rules stay the same.
And what about this idea of how do we help our children? How do we provide this warmth with the boundaries and all the energy that takes, and maintain some kind of balance in our lives? This is another question. How do we do that and keep this balance with our work and our leisure? Big question.
It's a big question. I think this may be, I've got no evidence for what I'm about to say, but it may be an issue of adults having babies, is that they want to continue the life they've had. And so that I think you have to accept that when you have kids, work-life balance goes out the window. Suck it up, honey. It just goes out the window. But where it creates a problem in a relationship is where one partner continues to live the lifestyle that they once did. What's wrong with going out with the lads on a Friday night and be home at 11 o'clock at night, leaving you at home, and you're a full-time worker too? That's where it gets to be a problem. Synchrony is really important, and having the same agreement on parenting style. And it's not natural necessarily. You've got to somehow negotiate it.
Great, good. So you've also brought up the issue of screens, and I just wrote down something here that you wrote in the book. Very good book. I really do recommend it too. The screens themselves are the neutral technology. It's what's on them. It's how your children interact with them. That's right. The key issue. Because there was some questions about, screens. We keep them away from screens, but they go to school and they use screens. So really, you're saying it's the content and...
Content and context.
Yeah.
Really important. Time is important as well, because time spent on a screen is time not spent doing other developmental activities. But there's a high level of complexity about screen use. So let's imagine for a moment you're the perfect parent, or the good enough parent. You've read this stuff about screens, and you've got a young child, and you're curating the content. And you might even be sitting with the child doing the content too. There's a real problem in the first 2 years with any screen content. Because if you actually watch Sesame Street or Play School, just time the time between edits where the shot changes. It's between 12 and 15 seconds. Now, you could have found a cartoon, for example, that you think is harmless. There's no violence in it. It's a lovely, sweet story. you've watched the cartoon, you've pre-watched it before you would expose your child to it. But what you've missed is that it's highly edited, highly intercut, and there's a change in scene every second or two. Evidence from the University of Washington, Seattle, and other places have suggested or shown that it's likely that that intercutting changes the neural networks in that young baby, and the way they look probably reduces the attention span and may increase the risk of attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder. So that exposure, so the best thing you could say, at least under 2, is don't have any screen exposure at all, because otherwise you're just going to be driven nuts curating anything. However, there's probably no difference really between reading a child a story on an iPad than on a book, although there is increasing research suggesting comprehension is different. Maybe not bad, but it is different with a physical book. So that's a real pitfall. Then your child, when they get older, will say to you, well, all my friends are on TikTok and Instagram. Why can't I be on it? Well, Instagram, upward comparison, big time. TikTok, upward comparison, big time. But let's say you curate that as well, and the child says to you, what's the harm? It's just a little kid playing with, my age, playing with a cat. What can be the harm here? So there's 2 or 3 things here. One is, if the time on TikTok and Reels is time where they could be outside playing, not good. If the TikTok and Reels is time where you could be spending reading them a story, this is potentially not good at all, because what researchers are increasingly worried about, and I talk about it in the book, is all you're getting on TikTok or Reels is an episode. Now, TikTok creators say, oh, I can tell you a story in 30 seconds. I'm sure it's true, but in the end, it's just an episode. When you sit down and read with your child a story, there's a beginning, there's a middle, and there's an end. There's a narrative. And there are actions which have consequences. The lamb trips on the rock and hurts herself. So you can have a conversation. Well, why did the lamb hurt herself? Well, couldn't she have gone around the side? Simple conversations like that, which decode the world and create a narrative they don't get on TikTok and Reels. So you have a generation growing up whose world is encompassed by single events rather than the course of events, which they can translate accordingly. So all this means is no screens, really, for much of their childhood through to middle childhood. Yeah, they can have it at school, and no mobile phones until they're 13, because then they're unleashed. And remember, would you give your child an addictive substance? Well, that's what you're doing by giving them a screen. And you do not know the effects. This is a human experiment where we don't fully understand the effects on the child. And it's happening at the second period of malleability in their brains.
There's another part to that question around screen time and the conflict that it causes in obviously many households, but in this particular household. So the large majority of homework is expected to be completed on a school-supplied device. How can we monitor and restrict its use to homework only, given that they don't have time to sit next to the
Well, the problem is if the computer is attached to the internet,
yeah,
and they have to use the internet to do their homework. Well, school principals should be taken out and shot for that. My son went to a school, albeit a private school in Sydney, and it's not an apocryphal story because you actually heard it, is that parents would come on the open day and they'd say, where are the computers? And they'd say, Cranbrook. So this was Sydney Grammar, and they'd say Cranbrook. And that's still the philosophy today at Sydney Grammar, one of the highest performing schools in Australia. I can teach somebody the technology of radio production in an hour. Mm-hmm. I cannot teach somebody in an hour narrative skills, how to tell a story, how to write coherently in English. I can't do that. That is not done on a screen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So let's move on to something else that you've touched, which is ADHD, and it's obviously on people's minds. And there's a request for some key advice around parenting, particularly when you have ADHD yourself. They're particularly talking about In the book, you really clearly differentiate the aspects of ADHD, which is really helpful. This person says the issues here, particularly around the impulsivity and then the meltdowns and the clashes.
Yeah. What I say in the book is that to be a parent, you need to be match fit. It's bloody hard. Giving up a lot, as we just talked about. If you have untreated mental health issues, get them treated, get them sorted out. Not necessarily because you're going to transmit them to your child, by the way. 65% of parents who have an anxiety disorder do not have a child with an anxiety disorder. It's not inevitable in any shape or form. But you become a better parent when you are not distracted by your own distress. And I'm using the psychological term distress here, which is depression and anxiety. Also, if you've got adult ADHD, and there are plenty of people with untreated adult ADHD, get it treated if you can. It's not that easy. You've got psychiatrists want to charge you $900 an hour for, hundreds and hundreds of dollars an hour anyway, for assessment and treatment of ADHD. But get it treated so that you are match fit for your child, who genetically may well have inherited, particularly in boys, but also in girls, your tendency to impulsivity and short attention span and so on. But we tend to think now that the world is filled with people with ADHD. The incidence of ADHD is 3%. Now, you can go to parts of Adelaide where there are far more than 3% of children diagnosed with ADHD. Guarantee you the middle class areas. And there will be poorer areas, Noarlunga or what have you, where the rate is much lower. But that's because there are children with ADHD in Noarlunga who are not being treated because they don't have the services there. And psychologists are to a penny in North Adelaide. So you are, not quite, but you know what I'm saying. So there's an imbalance here, but it's 3%. And the incidence of autism spectrum disorders, 2%. So neurodivergent children are a very, very important group of kids because they're talented, they've got things to offer and so on, to be focused on. But 95% of kids don't. And so we've just got to get things in a bit of perspective here.
So you don't buy into one of the questions that it seems like there's an epidemic, that everybody's getting diagnosed. You don't buy into that.
Oh, well, that's a different question.
Yeah.
It's a very, very different question. I did a 4 Corners on ADHD many years ago. And when I pitched the story, it was, people think this is a fictitious problem, and there are kids going untreated, and this 4 Corners should be about putting it in perspective. So in the way we do these, 4 Corners, you've got to find family stories that you film, and then you film the scientists and the researchers and what have you. About 3/4 of the way through the filming schedule, I had a rebellion on my hands from the producer and the cameraman because every child we filmed clearly did not have ADHD.
Oops.
And what I didn't want to show on the thing was the stereotypical child with ADHD who burns houses down and climbs on roofs and is completely out of control. In the end, I had to find one of those children, as much to convince the crew as elsewhere. But why were these children being diagnosed? Well, every household we went into with a child had television on in the background. Now, research just published last week, Australian research on screen use, showed that background television is toxic to a child's development. You do not have television on in the background. And that's the original screen.
Yep.
You do not have television on. They all had television on in the background. And pediatricians admitted to us that they could have 2 children with the same level of symptoms, and one got the label ADHD and the other didn't. Why? Because by giving the label, the school, usually a public school, got extra resources, which they otherwise wouldn't have got. So and now we've got the NDIS creating perverse incentives to give the child a diagnosis. So these parents get services that the state should be providing for them, but they only get it when they've got a label. In other words, the label doesn't count. It's the level of disability that a child has And fitting them to a label is often perverse. And then the other thing that happens in Australia is that they don't follow the international guidelines. So the international guidelines say, don't rely on the scales. So you come in with a child with ADHD, you're supposed to do a Connor scale, which the teacher's supposed to do, the family's supposed to do, etc., grandparents and what have you. And if you score over a certain level, you've got ADHD. What the international guidelines say is that is not the way to diagnose ADHD. The way to diagnose ADHD is talk to the parents, look at the child, talk to the teachers. How much is this child being affected by their behavior? And then you might add to the scale to just help you along a little bit. But that's how you deal with it. And then you find out what you've got to solve, because like with eating disorders, these kids with eating disorders do not have a nice, neat diagnostic category, but they've got an eating disorder. And you've got to find out what's going on in order to provide the most appropriate therapy.
So the other question around this is, how do you as a parent disentangle what could be ADHD behaviour versus a typical 5-year-old with all the synaptic messiness going on?
How much is that child's life being affected?
Right.
How much is it getting in the way of schooling? How much is it getting in the way of family life? How consistent is it? Things that bring it on. Not to diagnose it too early. Get a proper assessment. Don't jump into drugs too early, but also don't resist drugs if in fact they are going, they're clearly going to help. Not easy solutions, but you've got to look at each child individually. Years ago, we used to blame poor school performance on middle ear infections. And we had an epidemic of grommets to improve school performance. It doesn't happen anymore.
Well, let's talk a bit more about schools. How can we cultivate family values in our children that may not be aligned or consistent with what they're taught in school?
We have to ask what's happening at school if you believe that's the case. And, the school environment. Schools try very hard to inculcate a set of values. I mean, sometimes that's why parents resort to private schools, because they think, a Christian school in the outer suburbs is actually going to reflect their values much more closely than a public school, which I don't accept necessarily. So I'm just picking on religious schools. I'm Jewish. The Orthodox Jewish school in Sydney tells them Netanyahu is a really good guy. So Judaism has very strong values. I don't believe that Orthodox school is actually teaching good values to Jewish kids. If they grow up thinking Likud is the party of choice in Israel, for example. So, whereas the liberal Jewish school doesn't do that and gives the kids a traditional liberal education. But you'll get that in a lot of different schools. So I think children are always watching. Have you got the set of values yourself that you think you have? And the child's watching you. So if you're sitting at the table answering your work emails when you're supposed to be having a family meal, child sees you doing it. If you fly off the handle and a cup falls off the table and smashes on the floor, an insignificant event, the child watches it and thinks that's the normal reaction. What predicts, people have got multiple PhDs in trying to work out what predicts a child that's school ready. So I talk a lot in the book about being school ready. It's not a child who can read Shakespeare at 4 or understand maths at 4.5. It's a child who's got good emotional regulation, who can communicate, who's social. And the Australian Temperament Project and the longitudinal study of Australian children also can predict a child who's doing pretty well. When you're worried as a parent, are they doing well or aren't they? Are they social? So this is not a neurodivergent child. This is a neurotypical child. Are they social? Do they have friends? Do they see those friends? Are they playing sport? Are they involved in community activities? Are you taking them out to community activities? Which is a part about work-life balance. You've worked hard during the week and you spend your weekend as a taxi driver between sporting events. Predicts a very good outcome for your child. They might not become a doctor or an astrophysicist, but they become a good person. And if you're worried about your child, if they're doing those things, your child's pretty okay.
Right, are you ready for another of your biggies? There's a great chapter in the book about this too, about children wanting to change their gender, particularly in this age group.
It's a rare problem.
Right.
So the media makes a huge deal of it. Conservatives make a huge deal of it. But it's a rare problem. So in this age group, what you're talking about is puberty blockers. And so it's usually boys. And it's usually boys who have identified as female throughout their childhood. It can happen with girls too. And they want to be a girl or they want to be a boy. Research, probably the best research in this in Australia and internationally is Western Australia, where they've followed the kids through meticulously. There's good research from Queensland as well. And what they find when they follow the clinics in terms of kids who have been referred, the vast majority of these kids fall out of the clinic because they don't fit. They don't fit the criteria. They realize that they're talking about something else. They might actually turn out to be gay rather than have gender dysphoria. And the number who get to the point where it probably makes sense to give them puberty blockers is tiny. It's a tiny issue. Tiny, tiny, tiny. And what you're doing there is actually being reasonably confident that that child, when they get to maturity, is going to want gender reassignment of some kind. And if full-blown puberty has emerged, gender reassignment becomes a huge deal. It's much less of a deal, much less traumatic. And also what's less traumatic is the child identifying with their natural gender or queerness and integrating there when it's much easier to do so, rather than fighting with themselves, fighting with their parents, fighting with the system, and getting them through. But it's a tiny problem. The real problem is not covered in this book. The real problem is adolescent girls.
Oh.
Gender dysphoria is actually a normal part of being an adolescent girl, and not being sure about your identity and your gender identity or your sexual orientation. And social media and other influences have suggested to girls that if you've got those feelings, you're actually maybe queer, or you might be really, want to identify as being a male, and they come forward asking for sex hormones. And the huge controversy is, do they really need them? Have they been convinced by the screen world that invades their brains that they need sex hormones rather than just going with it till you come through?
And what age group are we talking here?
We're talking about kids, from 12 to 16, 18, 20, maybe even beyond.
Right.
And demanding sex hormones does not necessarily solve the issue, and it's not necessarily a problem. It's been there. There's something about being an adolescent female which makes you a bit more gender fluid. Now, some people in that group will be genuinely gender dysphoric, genuinely believe that their gender is not what they've been assigned, and that they're going to track through. But disentangling that, and you've got some GPs prescribing sex hormones without proper assessments. So that, to me, is the real issue, not this whole thing that they've got in Britain about puberty blockers and the Tavistock Clinic. This problem is a much more serious problem. But then you've got kids who are queer, and they should be accepted as such and integrated. And the rate of distress, self-harm in those kids because they're not accepted for what they are is outrageous.
It does remind me when my son was at childcare, and I got called in for a very serious interview because they'd noticed, and he is now 30, just to put this into context, a long time ago, he's not watching, so I can say this, that they were so worried because he really liked the dress-up box with high heels and a handbag. And of course I laughed my head off because I didn't mind at all anyway if he was wearing high heels, but I didn't have high heels. So they were novel to him, and I explained that to them. But I think that's a really good example of how things have changed now. Like, I don't think that conversation would happen now for the child care.
Hopefully they just accept what some kids do. Now, there is a slight predictive, and I talk about this in the book, that little boys who like dressing up as little girls often turn out to be gay. And that's a biological thing.
Yeah.
Actually, it's just there's nothing you can do about it. You can't reprogram. It's just going to go. And girls who like to be tomboys also might turn out to be lesbian, but it's not one-on-one. Far from it. Mm-hmm. And you can and by being overly anxious about it, you make the child overly anxious and feel alienated. Then the child doesn't talk about it and doesn't identify the way they should. So
there is now. Will you consider a book for teenagers? So I think that might be a yes. Don't you think that he just?
So that's a question. I haven't said yes.
I thought I heard a bit of a interest there in teenagers, but anyway.
There is a fourth book coming, but I don't know what it's going to be about yet.
I think we're working on that. I think this is you talk about the precautionary principle in your book, and there's a question here about what the most cost-effective public health measures could be that we could introduce to improve child health outcomes. So I think you've got some answers in the book. If he's asking.
So we need to breathe clean air.
Clean air.
Just something really basic. Fine particulate air pollution.
Yep.
So it's not. I mean, that's a feature of what's causing fine air particulate pollution is what's also causing a warm planet and climate change and system change. So clean air is really important. So a child growing up breathing in fine particulate air pollution, it's just like smoking. Causes inflammation, speeds up aging, can damage the child. And almost certainly is one of the reasons why Clyde Hertzman found low EDIs in certain areas. Mm-hmm. So there are certain suburbs of Adelaide where air particulates focus. In Sydney, where I come from, it's southwest Sydney, poorest areas of Sydney. It's having infrastructure and green spaces. Mm-hmm. It's having universal free childcare and early child education, which is going to benefit the kids who need it most. That's high quality, which means that you've got to pay early childhood educators a living wage, and have training and have career development. It's about, you started off talking about the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle is about removing a public health threat if you see it there and you think it's causing harm. So during COVID, we didn't understand COVID terribly well. And what we did was we went into lockdown, social distancing, and we shut schools. And one of the reasons we shut schools was to stop people circulating, but also we were looking at it like flu. So in a flu pandemic, you shut schools because it circulates amongst young kids. And we didn't realize that COVID was different in the beginning. And so we took the precautionary principle by shutting schools as the safest option. Probably did more harm than good by doing that. But in general, the precautionary principle is if there's pretty good evidence that something's causing harm, you should remove it from the environment or you should remove it, particularly if it doesn't do any harm by removing it. So there's pretty good evidence that screens are doing harm. The social media companies and others will tell you there's no evidence of that. Well, there is, but it's not solid randomized controlled trial evidence. But I challenge you to tell me what harm there is in not giving a child a screen and not giving them a mobile phone to 13. Now, the politicians have got onto this, and like politicians do on both sides, they take simplistic solutions. So we'll ban social media from children. It's not going to work. Children will get around it. It's an easy option for politicians because the hard option is regulating social media and insist they step up to their social responsibilities. So that gets them out of jail on that. And then parents might think, well, I don't need to do anything because it's banned, rather than improving their own screen use and teaching the kids sensible screen use. So banning is not going to work. But you as a parent, denying your child a screen for non-educational purposes, it's not going to do them any harm. They'll tell you, the kid will tell you it's doing them harm.
And that every other parent lets them have a screen.
Yeah, well, that's the conversation we've ever had. You know, parents in this room will say, "Oh, you were the only parent. You're the only parent who ever phones up to check that there is a party on. You're the only parent who turns up at the end of the party to pick me up and take me home. Nobody else does that." And of course, well, it's interesting when you have kids and you have parties, there only are a few parents who phone you up, but there are parents who phone up.
That's right. Look, I think it's very sad to say we've come to the end of the question time. The one question I was going to ask is, you finished the book saying this is the hardest thing you've ever done, or one of the hardest things you've ever done, that's writing this book?
Yeah, well, I've, as Jacinta said earlier, I'm on almost a founding board member of the Australian Research Alliance for Children and Youth, which is about children and youth well-being. What is the evidence base behind that? So I've lived and breathed that. I trained in pediatrics. I don't call myself a pediatrician, but I did train in pediatrics. And I've been reporting on this stuff for a long time. So I thought, okay, I kind of know this will be a doddle. No. The amount of evidence that you've got to sift through, the amount of crap research. There are a lot of amazing eating disorder researchers, but a lot of really crap eating disorder researchers. And so you've got to sift through what's reliable and what's not. Just because something's published in a journal does not mean it's good. And so sifting through that evidence and coming to a conclusion and resting on that and then explaining it clearly is tough stuff. But, so if it's hard for me, it's impossible for the average parent, which is why I did the book.
On that note, I think we can be really grateful that Dr. Norman Swan took the time to do that so that we don't have to do that. So I really encourage you to rush out and buy the book. Is that the right thing to say?
And I'll
get it signed. I really do. I have actually read it cover to cover, and I really recommend it as someone with step-grandchildren who stuffs up still after all this time. Very slow learner. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much to Dr. Norman Swan.